All right, so here we are at the last video and the time that we have together during the Creative Summit. So I want to talk now about contracts, licensing, and dispute resolution. But to recap really quickly, we discussed business structures, taxes, insurance, the sort of foundational elements of what I consider to be the sustainable elements of um, artistic practices. We talked about the four main areas of intellectual property that I believe are relevant to artists and how that applies to what artists may be doing on a daily basis. Now we're going to talk about these three topics, which I kind of pull all together because they really deal with how to manage relationships. So in my world, I help artists set up companies and set up practices. I help them manage and protect their IP. But the other thing that I do, I spend a lot of time doing, is helping to manage relationships between my clients and the marketplace. So, what I mean by that is, let's take our painter who wants to sell a work of art to a collector. It's more than just painter taking painting and giving it to collector and then collector giving painter money. There is often a sheet of paper that is exchanged in addition to the painting and the money. There's a sheet of paper or a digital file that is exchanged between those two parties, which memorializes or puts into writing the agreement for the sale of work. So if you are wondering what types of things may go in a contract for the sale of work, it includes the title of the work, it includes sometimes information about provenance and certificates of authenticity. It talks about any rights that the artist retains in the copyright of the work, which is separate than the physical object. So that sheet of paper has a lot of really interesting and important information in it. And that sheet of paper can become very important later on when the art is resold or if someone is trying to answer a question such as whether or not the art can be included in an exhibition. So the relationships that artists have with their clients, with people who are purchasing art or availing themselves of the services that artists are providing, those relationships, I would say, the best way to manage those relationships is to write them down. Write down the who, what, where, when, and why of your transactions. You know, contracts are, to me, in my opinion, are the main source of protection for artists. What I mean by that is that you can have a transaction, right? That painter and the collector, and that seems pretty easy. And it doesn't seem like that should be too complicated. But in the event where someone has a question about the price or has a question about authenticity or has a question about the sale, or in the event that, you know, someone else later on shows up and says, hey, wait a minute, I bought the same painting, or wait a minute, you know, they want to challenge the transaction itself, having a contract is important. Now, I'm not going to get into the difference between like oral contracts and written contracts and whether or not you can enforce an oral contract, but suffice it to say that I get a lot of comments sometimes by people who say, oh, well, I don't really have contracts, so there's nothing that can be enforced against me. Well, that's not true. A lot of courts will enforce an oral contract. That just means that it'll cost you more money to actually provide the court the evidence that is necessary to prove up whatever your position is in the transaction, either on the plaintiff side or the defendant side. So the only thing not having a contract does is increase your cost of litigation. I say that because I'm a transactional attorney and that I work with paper, so transactional attorneys work with a lot of paper. That is in contrast to litigation attorneys. Those are the attorneys that actually go to court. So I have litigation experience on the plaintiff side where I had the burden of proof to prove the case to the jury and or the court, and you need evidence for that. So when it comes to your relationships, the way that you work with individuals, even in the way that you collaborate with individuals, the more that you have things written down, that increases the protection that you have as an artist, because if anybody starts asking questions about the transaction or even your relationship with the other party, you at least have something that's written down. So I consider contracts to be the main source of protection for artists. licensing is a, really interesting because license agreements are a type of contract. And the whole purpose of a license agreement is to monetize the copyright. So, or the intellectual property, but we'll just stick with copyright. So remember I said there's one copyright and you have like multiple rights. Well, you can license, one aspect of your copyright to one entity to do, something like an art sell in a certain geographical region. You can license another gallery to represent you in a whole other region in another part of the world. There's different things that you can do with one copyright. And licensing agreements are the agreements that are used to help to, monetize artists' work. In the visual art world, a very popular example of that are artists who are like painters, for instance. So they have their fine art side of their artistic practice, but let's say they also do surface design. Or they do illustrations. That's a whole other side of their business, which tends to be more commercial. Well, a lot of those artists who straddle those two spaces, what they're doing is they're selling paintings, but at the same time, they're licensing some of their illustrations or just outright being hired to provide illustrations. Or they're licensing their designs to be used for wallpaper or to be used for tablecloths or whatever it is. So that's a really popular example of using licensing agreements to be able to monetize the various aspects of one copyright. And so licensing agreements are an opportunity for recurring income because you can have like one image, even for photographers, for stock photographs is another example. You have one image, you upload it into Getty Images or whatever the stock photography company website is, you upload it and you get paid a royalty every single time someone uses that image. So it's an opportunity for recurring income. And in terms of looking at ways to build a sustainable art practice, licensing is so important because it just creates multiple streams of income. When it comes to dispute resolution, I did want to talk about that briefly because, and this links back to what I just said about managing relationships. What happens is that sometimes things go sideways. Sometimes people forget that they agreed to do something, or sometimes everyone's on the same page and they have a contract, but something happens and there's a problem. So what typically needs to happen is a way to resolve the dispute with the other side. And if you're wondering where that can come up, it can come up with collectors. It often comes up with collaborators, people who are working together, people who have pooled their resources together to, let's say, produce something like a mural. Well, what happens when you run out of money for the supplies, but then the person who's supposed to be, negotiating with the municipality that is sponsoring the mural doesn't get more. There's so many things that can happen. And so one of the things that you want to be prepared with is just an idea about how you're going to resolve disputes. Often contracts have a procedure in the contract that provides a mechanism for resolving disputes. Sometimes contracts will say things like, if there's a dispute, there's like a cooling off period, and then you have some time to think about it, then you come together. If you can't resolve it, then you can go to mediation. If you can't resolve that, then maybe go to arbitration, and then the arbitration can be non-binding, meaning you don't have to really follow what the arbitrator says. And then after all of that, then the parties have the ability to sue each other in court for resolution. There's so many different ways to do this, but it is, I would say, wise to think about what your posture will be or what procedure you would follow if something one day goes sideways or doesn't go in the way that you anticipated. I spend a lot of time helping artists with these types of disputes. Even when there is a contract, sometimes the contract says one thing and then the parties' course of dealing with each other says something is completely different. This comes up often where the scope of a project changes or it expands from what's written down. And if you haven't been documenting that over time, it increases the likelihood of disputes. So that's why I have here, documentation reduces the likelihood of disputes. So the opposite is true. The less documentation you have about what you're doing, you're increasing the likelihood, you're increasing the risk of disputes. So even when if you have a project where you have a contract and you have a scope, this is what you're supposed to be doing. The moment it goes outside of that scope, you want to start to, vocalize that and maybe get a revised version of the scope. But the less you do that, the more there could be problems. And ultimately, if there's an issue, artists find themselves, searching out for attorneys who can help them. I'll say this: the more you build in like a methodology, or the more you come up with a policy with how you work with people or how you manage relationships, the less likely you'll need an attorney to fix something on the back end, because that process helps you uncover issues way before they even show up. So, I've worked with a marketing company, design firm that had tens of thousands of dollars in work that they were not paid for. And so then the question is, well, what do you do? Well, the option is to sue the person on the other side who's not paying. And, there's a lot of considerations in terms of even if you want to do that. In that particular scenario, the client had a contract, but at the moment in time where the scope started to shape shift, they were documenting this in emails, but there wasn't a period of time where there was actually like a point where you stop and say, okay, this is how much it's going to cost. These are your bills at this point. We're not going to deliver until you pay. Start to put into place these kind of mechanisms to decrease the likelihood of having to sue someone on the back end. So documentation is really important. And then I want to talk briefly about the difference between a handshake deal and a business deal. Within the art world, there are a lot of handshake deals. So what that means is, folks who in industry or market that is kind of unregulated, there are folks who have been dealing with each other based on, just overall trust, which is a good thing. And there are some galleries, there are some gallerists, there's some dealers, there's some folks out there who I've come across them who will flat out say, no, we don't do contracts. I dealt with something like that earlier today, where there was a gallery who was saying that they don't do contracts, but if my client wanted one, they'll sign it. So, there's a lot of that. There's a lot of those handshake deals. But I would say, listen, in my opinion, there's a big difference between a handshake deal and a business deal, especially if you're establishing a long-term relationship, which the incident that I just mentioned was a long-term relationship. It's definitely worth it to at least walk through and ask questions and get an understanding of what that relationship is, how you'll manage it, and what happens when there is a disagreement. How will you resolve the dispute? So that is the end of this video. Just some highlights on how important contracts are for managing relationships, what licensing agreements are, and how that can help you as an artist develop multiple streams of recurring income. And then a brief comments on dispute resolution and how you can decrease the likelihood that there'll be a problem with someone that you're working with. Thanks again for the time to visit with you guys, and good luck to you in your creative practice. Bye.